Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. This video is a revision video for Component 2 for EDEXCEL A-Level Politics in 2023. And essentially what I'm going to be looking at is the topics that aren't on the advanced information from 2022. So last year they released a load of advanced information. I did a video on all of that, so there is a video on my channel on all of that. So what I'm going to concentrate on in this particular video is the stuff that wasn't on there. This seemed to be a relatively effective method that I did one recently on component 1, so hopefully this one will prove as helpful as that one did to a number of people. So first of all, what will the paper look like? Well, it's very much like component 1. So you start off with part A, where you have a choice between two different source questions. And then you go into part B and you have a choice out of two different 30-mark essays. The one that's slightly different is part C. In that you need to find the non-core ideology that you have been studying. So for my students at TRC, that is nationalism. There will be two essays on your non-core ideology and you pick one of those. So again, it's out of this bizarre number of 84. You've got two 30-mark questions and one 24-mark question. I recommend to my students you spend about 45 minutes on part A, about 45 minutes on part B, and about half an hour on part C. And hopefully that all works out. One of the big things that is stressed in examiners' reports and things like that is that one of the big challenges of these politics exams is getting everything finished on time, and they comment on the number of unfinished scripts. So please try and be mindful and stick to your timings. So what kind of things were on there last year? Well, on the paper last year, there were things like Parliament and legislation, devolution, the Supreme Court, and different types of ministerial responsibility. So you might well have had a look at that one in terms of your practice. As well as the key elements of such an exam technique, and I would urge you to go and have a look on my channel for the stuff on how to do 30-mark source questions, how to do 30-mark essays, how to do 24-mark ideology essays, and then the guidance on these different AOs, what they're looking for in AO1, what they're looking for in AO2 and AO3. But there's this extra bit in component 2, which I would refer to as a synoptic element, and attached to the questions in sections A and B is this bit. In your answer, you should draw on relevant knowledge and understanding of the study of component 1, UK politics and core political ideas. You must consider this view and the alternatives to this in a balanced way. So that for the first part of that is really important. So anything that's in component 1 you can bring in and use. So that might be voting behaviour, it might be stuff on political parties, it might be electoral systems. And a lot of these bits, or any of the other elements, a lot of these bits tie really closely with some of the stuff in component 2. And this, I think, makes it really, really significant. And it can be a limiting thing. So if you don't make any kind of reference to some of the stuff from component 1, it can impact on your mark in that question. So let's have a look at some of the key bits. So 1.1 was not on last year's advanced information. So the nature and sources of the UK Constitution. And so in this it talks about an overview of the development of the Constitution through key historical documents, Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, Act of Settlement, Act of Union, Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949. You will notice that there is a line through the European Communities Act of 1972, so that bit has been chopped. The nature of the UK Constitution: entrenched, unentrenched, uncodified, unitary, and the two pillars of parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. The five main sources of the UK Constitution: statute law, common law, conventions, authoritative work, and treaties. And that did include European Union law. A lot of the European Union laws are still there, actually. They've just been transferred over. So this is one of those ones that feels a lot like just kind of contextual stuff, because you don't, obviously in politics we don't get short questions, so they aren't going to get you're not going to get a question, tell me about the Magna Carta, or explain the term unentrenched, but you might get something about whether the nature of the UK Constitution needs changing. This links with some of the other bullet points as we go through. 1.2 was also not on there. How the Constitution has changed since '97. Again, there's two videos that I've done on this. So one is one initial one unchanged since '97, and another one under changes under Johnson. So the spec tells you need to know about the House of Lords reform under Labour government, the electoral reform, devolution, Human Rights Act of '98, and the Supreme Court. Under the coalition, you've got the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which has obviously now been and gone, and further devolution in Wales. And then since 2015, we've seen further devolution in Scotland. And I think probably one of the big ones has been the development of the city mayors and city regions, and that kind of is it's a slightly different direction really for devolution in England in recent years. So again, there's clearly a kind of a question potentially out of this about the success of constitutional change since '97, about the degree of constitutional change since '97, whether it's slowing, whether it's been maintained. So there's lots of stuff in that one. So 1.1, as I said, is mainly foundational knowledge that you'll need for any constitution essay. The fact that 1.1 and 1.2 went in there last year, there was stuff on devolution, but in last year, but not directly on constitutional reform as a whole. So any question is likely to focus on the degree of change in recent years, linking 1.1 and 1.2 together, possibly linked with 4.3, which is to do with the European Union, or the idea that there needs to be further reform, especially linked with elements of 1.4. Now 1.4 was on there last year, but there's two clear bullet points in 1.4. One's on devolution and the other one isn't. Clearly, the biggest constitutional change in recent years has been Brexit. And this relates strongly to other elements of Section 1 in terms of parliamentary sovereignty. And there are other things that remain live issues. So laws reform remains a live issue. So again, linking to component 1, the Labour Party has continued to talk about the need for further reform of the House of Lords. It also talks about potential reforms to electoral systems. So that would again feed into something in terms of the current debates about the UK Constitution and potential future changes. The Human Rights Act continues to be a very live issue, again linking with Unit 1. The Conservative Party have talked about replacing it with a British bill. There was the Fixed Term Parliament Act that has been and gone, and so you could reflect on that in terms of what that tells us about democracy in the UK, again linking to an element of component 1. In terms of that change to the constitution, again, so there's lots of stuff in there. Links in with component 1, so stuff to do with rights, stuff to do with democracy, stuff to do with how much the constitution has changed or not, which would come directly out of 1.1, 1.2. So you might get a question that might be something like, evaluate the view that constitutional reform since '97 has made the UK more democratic. So it doesn't have. So they could be has made the UK. It could change. It could be more democratic. It has protected rights. Have been successful. So lots of different things. And if you got that one on about more democratic, that would bring a lot of the issues in that I've talked about above, and some of the stuff in Section 1 overall, such as devolution, the city regions. You could talk about in terms of decision making being made closer to the people. There's lots of illustrations of devolution in action through COVID, which is a good one in terms of demonstrating that stuff. It links to component 1 material, if I mentioned. So you've got things like the democracy fundamentally not shifted that much because we've still got the main voting system in place. Actually, some of the voting systems which are more proportional have actually been phased out. So we've lost the regional list system of the EU. Sorry, we've had the changes, the removal of SV. Rights is an important issue, and again, keeping things really current. We've seen recent restrictions on protests through amendments to the Public Order Bill and the rather long-windedly named Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act of 2022, as well as we've got legislation going through at the moment. We're looking to enforce minimum levels of service, restricting the ability of some of the public sector unions from striking. So we are seeing a large amount of stuff that is happening on this. So all the stuff to do with democracy and rights, you kind of go, oh, democracy and rights is component 1, but because constitution is component 2, those bits kind of really link in very, very closely together. And I think that this is kind of a really important element of that in terms of thinking about the way that these interact. Constitution, I think, is a nice, solid one to get a question on. The UK Constitution obviously isn't nice and solid. It's incredibly flexible. It's unentrenched, and you can say how there's positives to that in terms of it helps it adapt to the modern world as you go through. It is easy to change, so we're seeing almost this constant evolution of it. You can link a lot of this into some component 1 ideology stuff. You link it into conservative ideology, so idea of an organic state under Burke. So there is lots of good stuff in this, and I think it would make a good area for a question. I just wanted to do a bit on Brexit as a constitutional issue, because it is the biggest issue in terms of the constitution in recent times. So it was framed as a reclaiming of parliamentary sovereignty, and this idea that there was any law that was above British law, or any lawmaking body that was above Parliament. There has been a kind of a bit of difference in between theory and practice. In fact, what mainly has happened is most of the EU laws have simply been written into UK law. There has been some anger amongst the right-wing press and members of some of the conservative backbench groups, such as the ERG, that more has not been changed than actually has been so far. Again, there's an awful amount of huge amount of legislation in that. The government would argue it's been rather busy with some fairly major things, and therefore it will get round to all that kind of stuff. Northern Ireland Protocol has caused significant issues both in Northern Ireland and more broadly in the UK. Johnson's solution to this seems to be flouting international law. Sunak to change tack to a degree with the Windsor Agreement. And so we see the impact of Brexit on the UK Constitution, in particular the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Brexit was supposed to give the UK control of its borders, and that was one of the big things in the Brexit campaign. But this idea that Britain has control of its borders, you can argue, has rather been disproven by the fact that in recent weeks that net migration hit an all-time high at 660,000. So that bit doesn't seem to be the theory. Again, doesn't seem to have carried into practice. Interestingly, the SNP has used Brexit as a further argument for independence. Given that Scotland voted to remain, they've argued that Scotland should then be independent of the UK because the UK has made Scotland leave the EU. They seem rather keener on that referendum result than they do on the other one in 2014, but there we go. So it does definitively, again, show an impact of Brexit on the UK Constitution, because it's impacted on the relationship between the states in the UK, and it's fed into some of the arguments over devolution and independence. The UK obviously continues to collaborate with EU nations over significant issues, notably the Ukraine crisis, and therefore you could argue that things haven't changed as dramatically as people might well have thought. Opponents of Brexit argued that Brexit would lead to greater restrictions on rights within the UK, and since we've left, we have seen, as I've already mentioned, restrictions on protests through amendments to the Public Order Bill and the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, and we have seen restrictions on striking enforced through the minimum service levels going through for the trade unions. So there is plenty in there in terms of Brexit as a constitutional issue, and what it's done to where power lies, what it's done in terms of promise versus reality, and particularly I think some really important things to do with the relationship within the Union, so the relationship with the different states within the UK, particularly Northern Ireland and Scotland. So lots of stuff you could get your teeth into if they chose to go down those lines, and this links very much in with 4.3, which I'll get to in a little while. So 1.4 was on last year, but the question last year was on devolution. So we can see how that would link in with that one. So an overview of the extent to which individual reforms since 97 listed in 1.2. So 1.2 is on this year, therefore that means that becomes more significant, or isn't. And it's not advanced information this year, but 1.2 wasn't on last year. It is there. It is there with everything else this year. So that makes you think, well, maybe they'll do something in that direction. So you could get something again, evaluate the views that constitutional reforms since 97 have not gone far enough, evaluate the view that the UK should introduce a codified constitution. So again, one of those is about how far they have gone, and the next one is about whether they should be taken further, and think about the arguments for a codified constitution. So codified constitution will give you greater stability versus the current situation we have, that gives you a great deal of flexibility. A codified constitution might give stronger protection of rights. You could argue, well, actually rights are already well protected, a long history of rights being protected in the UK. You could say a codified constitution would give clarity with a separate tier of constitutional law, versus the argument, well, actually it's just too difficult to transfer all the stuff that is the UK constitution into a kind of codified document, because you've got all the conventions and the complexities of different types of laws and stuff in it. You could argue that we need a codified constitution because essentially the executive has too much power, the idea of elected dictatorship. And you could counter that by saying one of the good things about the UK political system is that the executive is strong and decisive, and so we don't end up with the gridlock and stuff like you would end up with the American system. So there's lots of tried and trusted arguments about whether there should be a codified constitution or not, and that fits in nicely. You should be able to evaluate all the different constitutional changes that have taken place and think about the direction of travel in terms of everything that's happened since 97. Right, now we're now jumping to section 2, so 2.1, the structure of and role of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So a lot of this, again, seems to be the kind of foundational knowledge stuff. So how members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords are selected. You need to know about the different types of peers. So you need to know that there are still hereditary peers, but they're a small number, and there's a voting system in terms of working out who has it. There's been lots of controversy about appointments, notably the fact that Liz Truss gets some. Johnson, of course, is always controversial when it comes to these things as well. You've got the main functions of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the extent to which these functions are fulfilled. Again, so this stuff could come into a broader question about Lords reform, or a broad question on the functions of one or other of the houses, or both of the houses. So the functions are legislating, scrutiny, both of secondary legislation and of government and its departments, notably through committee. Representation of the people, so you need to know the different theories on representation, which again would link you in with component 1. And then the arguments about whether the House of Lords can represent the interests of the people, even though it's unelected, and then they are to carry out national debate, and therefore we know the issues and the different sides of the issues because we can watch Parliament and watch them shouting at each other. And on all of this, you can ask the extent to which Parliament is effective. How effective is the House of Commons in these different ones? How effective is the House of Lords in these different ones? And so this links back to the stuff in Constitution. It links to some of the stuff that you will have done in Unit 1 in terms of representative democracy. It will give you a chance to show off lots of good examples of things that have been happening. And again, so it's important on this that you've got a good kind of set or basis of examples of controversial things and important things that have gone through Parliament, not gone through Parliament, all those kind of things in recent years. And think about government being held to account. Again, some of this will fit into the relationship in between the Parliament and the executive, which again I'll cover in a little while. Also, one of the areas missed out last year was 3.3, Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So 3.3.1, the power of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, the factors governing the Prime Minister's selection of ministers. Again, it's something to go and make sure you've got an idea on. There's been some interesting stuff about whether you go for all your own people or balance across the party. And again, this fills into some stuff that from component 1, where you need to think about, for example, the factions within the Conservative Party, the varying views on Europe within the Conservative Party, and the degree to which the Prime Ministers have or haven't tried to form balanced cabinets. Liz Truss notably didn't. The factors that affect the relationship between the Cabinet and the Prime Minister and the way these have changed, and the balance of power between Prime Minister and Cabinet. Well, this relationship between Prime Minister and Cabinet is potentially a very rich area for questions at the moment, in particular with all the events of recent years. We have, first of all, Boris and others in Cabinet, first of all, undermining and then creating the downfall of May. We had Javid resigning over a row with Boris about being able to keep his own advisors. So we saw this kind of power game between Johnson and Javid on that. We saw the Cabinet with the various scandals eventually turning on Boris. There was quite a startling number of resignations. I believe it was ultimately it was over 100. Some people resigned more than once, I think, amongst ministers and other government officials. So we can definitely see how essentially Cabinet can force a Prime Minister out. So Boris seemed to essentially start a campaign and got rid of May. There's then a concerted effort amongst the Cabinet to get rid of Johnson, and I think at one point they were resigning quicker than he could appoint them. So we then see Truss come in, and there's an argument she had a kind of a really unbalanced cabinet. So she appointed her own people who agreed with her. She didn't take in a broader view of the party, and therefore things went wrong very, very quickly. We see potentially arguments about lack of loyalty between the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet. So we saw Cabinet members turning on the Prime Minister. With Liz Truss, we saw Liz Truss turning on her closest ally in Cabinet, where she seemed to turn on Kwasi Kwarteng rather quickly and kind of went, this is all your fault for imposing that economic policy stuff that I told you to do. You're sacked. Which was slightly odd. But it does, again, it shows about the relationship between the Prime Minister and Cabinet. So often the Prime Minister will try and use members of Cabinet as scapegoats for things that are going wrong. We had this odd position where Truss went, and we didn't know who was going to be the new Prime Minister, but we knew that Hunt was going to stay on as Chancellor, and therefore he seemed to be that he was the most powerful person in the party and in government at the time, not whoever was going to become leader. And then we've seen the sackings and non-sackings under Sunak. So we saw the long drawn out process over Dominic Raab. We've seen the stuff with Braverman going on at the moment. So little Richie does seem to dither a bit when it comes to this kind of stuff. And there's all this the bit with the Prime Minister essentially being jury, judge, and executioner when it comes to judging ministerial standards and what should happen to ministers. Sunak does seem to take his time sometimes on some of these bits and not necessarily come across as being hugely strong. But as I said, there's loads and loads of stuff that have been going on in this bit, and you can go further back as well. But I think it's a really rich area with lots to talk about. So the next one, 3.3.2, the powers of the Prime Minister and Cabinet to dictate events and determine policy. So students must study the influence of one Prime Minister from 45 to 97 and one post-97 Prime Minister. So in terms of non-current ones, then I tend to use Thatcher and Blair as the big two on this. But you don't have to be those two. It could be any. You might be you might want, I don't know, Attlee and Heath. Who knows? So whichever ones for pre-97, and then you might really want to do Cameron post-97, or Brown or Truss or whoever. But I would have kind of some historic ones. I think Blair and Thatcher, because of the length of their terms in office, gives you a little bit more to get your teeth into, and obviously because of the impact they've had on modern politics. And then I would make sure you know lots about the recent ones as well. So this could feed into, and it links in with the previous bits of the section 3.3.1, could lead to change over time questions. So evaluate the view the Prime Minister has less power to dictate events and determine policy than they used to. And there's plenty to illustrate weakness in recent Prime Ministers, notably Truss, who was outlasted by a lettuce. But we did have some. We have in the modern day had some periods of dominance, notably Boris Johnson for a brief period of time following the general election in 2019. You can argue that with Brexit, COVID, and the Ukraine crisis, there has arguably been a context in which any Prime Minister would struggle to dictate events. I mean, since the 2019 election, the Conservative government has been, in terms of parliamentary terms, in a very comfortable position with a very solid majority. However, we have seen a revolving door at number 10, which might suggest that the problems are essentially to do with the different prime ministers we've had and their particular flaws, and therefore maybe we've had a bad batch. And it's not been quite as stable as it has been previously. So even if you go back a bit, you can think about Major, maybe not seen as an absolutely outstanding Prime Minister, but someone who wins an election and survives for a good length of time. Cameron negotiates the coalition and then wins an election, and then obviously falls on his sword following the defeat in the Brexit referendum. May, the old Maybot, said strong and stable a lot, but wasn't. So we've seen a lot of change in terms of prime ministers, more so than normal, really, in recent years. And so something reflecting that and the weakness of prime ministers, even in situations where they should have been fairly strong. I remember teaching the kind of Unit 1 and Unit 2 last year to my then Year 12s, now Year 13s, and thinking, well, we've done Conservative Party and we've done Boris Johnson, everything will stay pretty nice and solid from then until they do their exam. And then it all fell to pieces. So there is some good stuff to get in there and analyse, and I'm sure, like in all your classes, like we have that in mind, we've been talking about all this stuff that's been going on as it's been happening, and you should have plenty therefore to illustrate the problems that prime ministers face and how they can't always dictate events and determine policy, and even when, like Liz Truss, they have a clear, very clear idea of what policy should be, they don't always get it through, even if they have a strong majority in the House of Commons. And this links us into 4.2, this relationship between the executive and Parliament. So the influence and effectiveness in Parliament holding the executive to account, the influence and effectiveness of the executive in attempting to exercise dominance over Parliament, the extent to which the balance of power between Parliament and executive has changed. So again, all that stuff I've just been talking about all fits in with this. So so you can bring in a lot from the years wrangling over Brexit, and in that you can argue that Parliament reasserted its old authority and defied and frustrated the wishes of the executive. So May's administration, Johnson's administration, remember, before the 2019 election, he lost almost every single vote that he had in Parliament. I think he lost a record number of votes at the beginning of his time as Prime Minister. Obviously, that changes following the election in 2019. The May administration and Johnson's before 2019 were also restricted by the competence supply deal with the DUP. Before that, we have the coalition 2010 to 2015, and the relationship then is different, isn't it? Where we haven't got one party that hasn't got a majority, it has to work with another. and we saw a different way of operating with the kind of the kind of the four key individuals, two Liberals, two Conservative in the cabinet rather than cabinet as a whole. And all of this has brought shifts in power at different points in time. Was it all a blip? However, have we now gone back to it? Now, there was a bit. Again, that shows you how difficult this subject can be sometimes, and how interesting it can be as things change all the time. Post the 2019 election, we kind of think, and now things will return to some kind of normal. It is hard to argue that anything has been normal in the last couple of years, and so we have still seen Parliament holding the executive to account, and again, the Truss administration is a really good example of that, and Johnson again being held to account over things like Partygate by his parliamentary colleagues. Again, there seems to be a lot in this that you can talk about, particularly from recent years. You can bring in the case studies and compare it further back over time, if that's the kind of question that they could ask on it as well. Right, this is the bit where it all gets a little bit complicated. So in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's mind as we were originally going through this bit just should go, but it hasn't. It's been altered. The aims, role and impact of the European Union, EU on the UK government. So the aims of the EU, including the four freedoms of the single market, social policy is gone, but the political and economic union and the extent to which they achieve, that bit is still in there. So you need to know what the EU is and essentially the very basics about how it works. They've then taken out the two old bullet points in terms of, so the role of EU in policy making. Well, obviously it doesn't have a role in policy making anymore because we've left. And then the effects of two EU policies and their impacts on political system and policy making in the UK. Well, that again we've left, so that one's gone. So what it's been replaced by is the impact of leaving the EU on UK parliamentary sovereignty in relation to policy making. And there's lots you could talk about on that. So you can talk about migration, for example, and there's been a lot of stuff about that in the news and lots of stuff to talk about in terms of that. Trade is a really big one on that. You could talk about rights, and so there's lots of stuff I've talked about already that you could bring in and talk about it. So 4.3 to me now links mainly back to the stuff on the Prime Minister and Cabinet policy dictating and making policy, and in particular back to the stuff in section 1 on the Constitution, because that it is the big constitutional change that has happened. So they could ask about how has the former membership of the EU affected the UK Constitution, so effectively how big an impact has leaving the EU had on the UK Constitution, and again the stuff I looked at earlier in the video on that. Has the withdrawal from the EU affected the location of sovereignty within the UK? Well, it's strengthened parliamentary sovereignty, arguably, and then you can talk about all the stuff that's happened since. So it can be related to a whole range of areas. So it can be related to parties, going back to component 1, so the policies of the parties towards the EU and Brexit, the impact that UKIP and the Brexit Party have had in UK politics. It can link in with the stuff on elections, so the role in 2015, where essentially the promise of the referendum was put in, and then we see 2017 and 2019 kind of as the Brexit elections. And that impacted on things like voting behaviour, stuff in terms of potential future constitutional change and linking with voting. Recently, Labour has suggested giving the vote to EU nationals who are long-term resident, right to remain in the UK. We've seen, as I talked about earlier, the big impact on relationship between Britain and Northern Ireland and demands in Scotland. So it was important in the DUP supporting May's government. We've seen the collapse of the power sharing in Northern Ireland due to objections to the Northern Ireland Protocol and issues over hard and soft borders and borders in the middle of the Irish Sea. all this is seen as a potential threat to the Good Friday Agreement, and we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, the SNP using Brexit as an argument for independence. And we've seen their views and their ability to carry things out as having a big impact on different prime ministers. So, and particularly in the Conservative Party, their ability to avoid mass rebellion from their backbenchers in terms of the different groups there are, particularly the very, very strongly anti-European groups like the ERG, which can make support from them can make or break Conservative prime ministers to an extent. So the EU stuff could turn up. It's likely to be related to either constitution or policy. And so you need to be prepared to talk about it in those ways. And it's related to constitution and policy in terms of us leaving. And that's the new direction, really, of the spec. And you need to know what it is as a starting point. So 4.4 links again back to 4.3, and it links also back to some of the stuff I've talked about in terms of constitution. So the location of sovereignty in the UK political system. So the distinction between legal sovereignty and political sovereignty, the extent to which sovereignty is moved between different branches. I mean, the big one on that really is the argument about whether the executive or Parliament hold all the power, and where sovereignty can now be said to lie in the UK. So the position of sovereignty has shifted slightly back towards Parliament with the leaving of the EU. And we can see that essentially Parliament has asserted its power during the Brexit debates, but given the right circumstances or particular circumstances, then the executive can be seen to dominate, and we get this idea where we have a government with a large majority, and then it gets this idea of an elected dictatorship. So essentially, whatever the governing party wants to do, it can do, because the Lords can only delay, and it can't block things that are in the manifesto, and it can't stop finance bills. And there might be disgruntlement amongst some backbenchers, but you need a really big rebellion to stop anything if there's a large majority. With the 2019 election, as already mentioned, you would seem to move into this position, but the expected executive dominance has not remained fully intact. The power of Tory backbenchers has been clear with some rebellions and the removal of 2 prime ministers. And so the picture above me, Graham Brady, who was chair of the 1922 committee, which is the backbench committee, the backbench group of the Conservative Party, he at times, the man in grey suit, seemed to be the most powerful man in the UK, because there seemed to be a revolving door at number 10 when we had Boris, then Truss, then Sunak, but Graham Brady kind of stood there throughout it, kind of going, I'm now going to choose a new Prime Minister. Or me and my colleagues are now going to choose a new Prime Minister. We have decided that the current Prime Minister should step down. I've had a word with him or her, and they've decided that they will. And so we get this idea that maybe we've got a different bit of power base. So it's within Parliament, but it's concentrated. So the opposition can't get rid of the government, because they're not in a position to be able to do that. But it appears that the government's own backbenchers can, and we particularly have seen that through Graham Brady in the 1922 committee over recent years. So that's an interesting one in terms of sovereignty. But again, it's worth knowing all these different stuff about arguments about Parliament having the power, arguments about executive having the power, and thinking about how situations over recent years and the past, linking into the case studies, have altered that. Right, for this next bit, this will be hugely relevant to my lot and some others of you who do nationalism. However, I'm afraid I haven't got anything on any of the other non-core ideologies other than nationalism, because that's the only one I've got stuff prepared on, because that's the one I teach. So I'm going to show you some of the stuff we've got on nationalism and talk about some of the kind of the key areas. But if you don't do nationalism, this may not be enormously helpful. So just to remind you that there's a whole set of lovely videos on nationalism, just like there's been going through on everything all the way through. So you need to make sure that you understand the basics. You need to know about nationalism and human nature, nationalism and society, nationalism and economy, nationalism and state. You need to know about the different types of nationalism. You need to know about the key thinkers, and all those different bits that I've got videos set out in all of those. And I think there's another one about using key thinkers within the essays. So then you've kind of got some other important debates. So you might be talked about whether nationalism is rational or irrational. So rational, Rousseau definitely, arguably Garvey. Irrational, definitely Herder, elements of Manzini, and absolutely Maurras. There are elements of nationalism which are progressive, notably Rousseau. Also some elements in terms of the writings of Manzini and Garvey. And then there are elements of nationalism which are very strongly regressive, such as Herder and Maurras. You need to think about some of the ideas of internationalism. So internationalism in there should include liberal internationalism and socialist internationalism. Both are mentioned in the spec. And then obviously you've got Pan-Africanism with Garvey's writing. So can you have kind of international movements as well as national movements? And you think about Rousseau and the idea of kind of lots of independent nation states, with the idea that they can all work together. Now you can be asked about things like the significance of race, culture, and language in nationalism. So race is a particularly interesting and controversial one in terms of is or should nationalism be linked to racism. And then we've got other bits that you could look at in terms of beliefs in self-determination. Do nationalists agree on this? Is there a common idea about empire and colonies and colonization amongst nationalists? So there's lots of interesting stuff. It is a challenging ideology, but a really interesting, significant one in the world at the moment. And so again, make sure you go through your key thinkers, think back over your structures, and again, you should be able to cope with whatever questions they ask you. Obviously, one of the nice things is there's going to be a question on your non-core ideology. So for those doing nationalism, there's going to be a question on nationalism, and therefore you can be prepared for all the different types. Right, again, another long one. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. If you've any comments or questions, please leave them below. If you like this one, I know lots of people like the component 1 one, then please give us a like. I will be putting together one in the next couple of weeks on component 3A, the USA one. I'm afraid I don't teach global, so it will just be the US one, which is the one that I do teach. Right, again, thank you very much for watching.